Well, Scarbs, over to you. The world champions, what have they produced for 2023?
Well, I mean, this has been the longest wait of the whole pre-season. They launched, an old car, and we had some grainy shots of them testing at Silverstone. But finally, we get to have a look at the RB19, and I find it quite hard to know how to tackle it because, in lots of respects, it just looks like a RB18 plus. It looks so similar to the old car, but just made a little bit more extreme in every respect. And some of the changes under the skin that I expected, we know that haven't appeared. So I feel I should be saying, well, this is all quite disappointing. But actually, this actually looks like, again, another one of these really exciting cars. And so far, as testing has proved, a car that is ready to pick up from where it left off at the end of last year.
Given the state of Formula One regulations at the moment, and given how good last year's Red Bull was, no surprise really that they haven't been able to find a lot to change on the car that they could have changed anyway. So let's just go through it from front to rear from your perspective.
Okay, so starting at the front, one of the things which kind of surprised me with the car is they've raised the tip of the nose and the center section of the front wing ever so slightly upwards, looking a little bit more like last year's Aston Martin and a bit like the Alpine this year as well. Now, I thought that would be the direction everyone took last year, but actually everyone was going quite the opposite direction. So in theory, it should let more air under the car, which feeds the underfloor, which works really well. But other people are using that front section of nose and wing to start to shape the vortices that go under the car. And they've stepped away from that. So that's quite interesting that the shape of the nose cone itself has changed ever so slightly, which may kind of overcome the change in height that they've put there. But that's all pretty standard. They haven't gone as far as Mercedes with the front wing end plate where the wing elements merge into it. They haven't gone for this kind of legality loophole cutout, but they have taken another piece of Mercedes ideas, well, not obviously Mercedes ideas, they hadn't seen it at that time, but a little downwash fin on the inside of the front wing end plate, just where the wing elements join it. A trick that several teams have used this year and no doubt will be, exploited up and down the grid as the rest of the year goes on. They've kept that same extreme front suspension, sort of going back. Equally, the underfloor inlets, very high, very broad, really trying to maximize the air that's going underneath and out the sides of the floor. And then we come to the side pods. Now, last year, I mean, I think we could probably argue that Red Bull kind of won that battle, if you can even describe it as that, in terms of they had this deep undercut on the side pods. They had lots of air spilling off the top, spiraling around the sides with that odd little crease that they have. And then what we then call the water slides, where the side pod top surface just slopes down to the floor. Everyone's really kind of taken that as the inspiration and has mainly followed that this year, again, with the exception of Ferrari and Mercedes, just as it was last year. But what Red Bull have done, have kind of taken it to a bit more of extreme. So the undercut that starts underneath the side pod inlets is much more extreme. It's much deeper. It goes much further back down with the car before it flares out over the edge of the floor. So if you actually took the side pods and cut them in half, looking at the side, top half looks very similar. The bottom half, you've got this big undercut, and then you have this sort of semicircular channel that goes underneath the side pod, which is even more extreme than last year. You really see a very sharp crease in the bodywork of that kind of flashy side to the side pod. And they're doing something really clever here. Most teams, when they have the undercut come out to the floor edge, they're using that to actually push the air onto the floor edge to get the floor edge to do work, creating this vortex that goes all the way down and then in between the rear wheels and the diffuser. What Red Bull appear to be doing is still creating that floor edge vortex that everyone else is doing, but in this channel, it's almost as though they've got another vortex flowing down there. And we can see from the flow vis that it's not a straight airflow through there. You can see the kind of the spirals in the flow vis paint that they've applied to it. So you can see that the air is moving. And it's probably doing a couple of things. One, it's probably driving this floor edge vortex, which is so important to these cars with the change in shape that we've had from the regulations last year. But equally, the undercuts vortex is also driving airflow to the diffuser into the beam wing, which creates lots of downforce. So they're kind of getting a kind of a double vortex set up here, which is like really, really clever. And again, this is why I kind of say you go back to the pen of Adrian when you see this. It's, all the lines are very organic, and there's nothing there that looks awkward or out of joint that CFD and CAD would lead you to create. So very much a Newey car there. The side pods look very big. And in years gone by, as we've spoken about so much, skinny side pods have been a sign of, really good aero. Under these regulations, with the lack of barge boards, large side pods can actually mean good aero. And it's nothing to do with how good or bad the cooling inside the car is. And this is where one of the most interesting facts of the car has appeared. Now, we've spoken a lot over the past year about how they cool the air from the turbocharger before it goes back into the engine. And obviously, Formula One cars, like road cars, run intercoolers to cool that air down. Last year, lots of the teams, and this year, McLaren as well, we believe, have all run these 3D printed intercoolers, which have got a water jacket around the outside and basically takes the volume of the massive intercooler out of the side pod and tucks it away inside the car, which is great for aerodynamics. Now, I expected Red Bull to follow this route with the Honda engine because it's a kind of a development that would be between the two parties, or I say Honda and Red Bull powertrains. But they haven't. They've kept these massive intercoolers, one in each side pod, tucked right down next to the engine by the exhausts. And I find that surprising. They are lighter and they do produce slightly more power, but are slightly less inconsistent. But everyone else has kind of gone that way. And, it's a nice packaging solution. Red Bull haven't. So that's quite interesting. So you can see that, with this kind of RB18 plus concept that they've got, and knowing that they've got, they've been tight on budget in years gone by, which has come along to bite them, particularly with the reduction in aero testing. It's almost as though Red Bull have now learned a lesson and have thought, right, we're going to be really careful with the budget. We're not going to kind of go out, redesign everything, go for all the latest technology, completely change the aero concepts. We're going to be quite frugal with how we're spending our money and our development time. And I think that is the result of the car that you have here. Obviously, they had the advantage of having arguably the fastest car throughout last year, albeit with competition from Ferrari and Mercedes at each end of the season. So you can see that there's almost a more considered approach here from Red Bull, which is perhaps what you wouldn't expect. And I think is absolutely the right direction to go, knowing, the budget restrictions and particularly with their aero testing restrictions going into next year as well. So overall, it's looks like it's a conservative approach. And, obviously there's lots of mileage left in this for the rest of the year. But I think they've kind of just hit the right note at the beginning of the season between being sort of too aggressive and spending too much money and thinking out the long game.
Fascinating. And I wonder if we could go so far as to say that had they not had this penalty from the budget cap issue, maybe they would have changed the intercooler design. What do you think it comes down to that?
I wouldn't be surprised if we'd have seen a slightly more aggressive car in every respect if they had had more aero testing for this year and going into the next. So, yeah, I think that has had an impact. But I think Red Bull have kind of mitigated that in the best possible way. And I think, this is, you always fear that someone will go to one extreme or another with this sort of situation. I think they've kind of found that middle path. And I think it will work well for them, both for the 2023 championship and, 2024 as well.
What you were saying about the double channel there, particularly interesting. Double diffusers, now double channel. Is this going to be a trendsetter? Can other teams, if it really works well, and it appears to be working well, can other teams adapt that, or is that a huge packaging issue?
It's not so much a packaging issue. There could be some impacts with the radiators, but again, the side pod shape now is much less dictated by the size of your radiator package. In fact, your radiators could be even bigger if you wanted. Obviously, you don't want to because that's a weight and an aero drag issue. But other teams could follow this. But what you have to remember, this is a big change in philosophy. The teams at the moment are kind of refining their aero philosophies, particularly around that kind of underfloor, floor edge area, which brings the side pods into the equation too. To suddenly change that would take a big piece of aero work. And again, a lot of the front teams are, have less aero testing than the teams at the back of the grid. So they would have to decide whether that's something they would want to do in season or have something on the back burner ready for 2024. In theory, the teams at the back of the grid have got more than enough aero time to put into this. But, arguably may have the least to gain from it because, they're already at the back of the grid. So it's going to be interesting. The question will be can they find more time in their existing packages? And I think certainly for most teams this year, I think it will be refining what they've got, having had, most teams having a relatively difficult 2022. 2023 should be the year that you get everything right. And then make a jump forwards. But maybe there's someone out there that's going to take a risk. We don't know.
If Red Bull look at the S-duct that you very nicely described on the Ferrari, would they have the capability of putting that on this car? Is it something they would be looking at, do you think?
I mean, I think so. Yeah, I mean, there's only one car out there that I think wouldn't suit it, which is the Mercedes, because they have a slightly different arrangement for the sidepod inlet, and they don't effectively have a sidepod undercut like everybody else does. So yeah, everyone could incorporate it. Now I've looked at the way that Red Bull applied the bodywork to the side of the chassis, particularly the way the floor goes, and they have this blended section around the floor, almost like an aircraft wing, where the wing root goes into the fuselage. And you can see there's a big area there where they could put a duct in. They've got a very big undercut, and there's a big long run of bodywork there for the airflow to start to do its work, and the boundary layer will build up. So an S-duct would, it certainly improve the setup there. And I wouldn't be surprised, and I'm led to believe other teams have been looking at this over the winter, in fact, even in 2022 as well. So I wouldn't be surprised to see this cropping up on a number of cars over the first few races.
Just in general, Scarbs, when you're looking at the cars now as they're running in Bahrain, have we seen updates that are well away from what we saw in the launch pictures? Anything that comes to mind?
It's strange, actually. I mean, we've only had 3 days of testing, which I think has really impacted what teams are doing and how they're deciding to bring updates, plus the fact that it's such a long season. There hasn't really been anything that's kind of jumped out as being dramatically different from the launch pictures, other than stuff that we kind of picked up very early, like, the Aston Martin side pods, for example, and the changes to the cars between the renders and the real cars. Nothing really has really jumped out. Teams aren't running their absolute latest aero package. Particularly with the floor edges, you can see a lot of them are very reminiscent of what they were running late last year already. The one area, as you say, really has been the change in front wing philosophies, and particularly the way that teams have adapted to the new regulations where, as I said, the front wing elements meet the end plate. And we saw last year Mercedes created that big cutout there with playing around with the geometry. Now the regs changed, and everybody's looked at this again, and there's already at least 3 or 4 teams that have got this downwash fin or playing about with the shape of the elements in that area to try and create a bit of downwash, a little bit of outwash, just to try and offset the turbulence that the front tire creates between itself and the ground as it's spinning around. And yeah, I mean, I think that's probably going to be one of the areas that will stay quite static through the year. I think a lot of teams will probably pick up some of these little details, but looking at other teams, although Ferrari have got these slot gap separators, which are normally like that lovely little arched half moon shape, have created a vein, which was what Mercedes did last year, and put 5 of them in a very tight row, which what the regulations were trying to write out. Now, I still think that these are going to be, raised as an issue by other teams if we get to the first race. And we'll have to see what the FIA and the other teams say about it. But actually, even then, when you go and look at other teams which don't have the extravagant veins, but have stacked 5 big slot gap separators very tightly on that last gap between the fourth and the third elements, are equally as debatable as aero rather than structural. So again, I think the FIA may need to release a technical directive just to clarify exactly what's going on here, what you are and you're not allowed to do. I don't think these regulation rewrites they did over the winter quite go far enough. But even if Ferrari can run these, I don't think these are a game changer. These are like a little detail. And I think lots of teams have got lots of these kind of little details that they'll bring out over the opening races that will just produce that last little degree of performance. And I think some teams, and I believe Mercedes in particular, have got some of these kind of little detail updates, which can appear to be quite radical when they come out, may hold them back until they've got the rest of the car working in the way that they would want to.
Speaking of getting work done, just as a final point, Mercedes, I think, had a hydraulic problem when they first ran at Silverstone. They lost a lot of time on day 2 at the test with another hydraulic problem. Any thoughts on that? Well, in the context of many other teams just having great reliability, it would seem, out of the box.
Yeah, so Mercedes on the first day of testing, it was a fuel system problem, as we understand. They had a hydraulic problem day 2 of testing. They've had, there's been lots of rumors, so with a greater or lesser degree of truth about them, about problems with the chassis, problems with suspension, problems with steering, and vibrations because of the sensors on the steering wheel, all sorts of things sort of going on. And that, when you compare, you've only got 3 days of testing and you compare them to everybody else that has had a really kind of clean testing, you've kind of got to get these 3 days done, and Mercedes haven't had that. Now, we've seen some speed out of the car, which is obviously good. The drivers certainly feel a bit more comfortable in the car as the test reaches the third day. But equally, losing time, having lots of issues just suggests that their season isn't going to start as quickly as they would like. Now, I've got no doubt these are just teething problems and will be ironed out without any detriment to the kind of their performance over this whole season as it expands to the 23 races. But yeah, I mean, it's always a problem, but I still see them at the moment pinned as that third team posed to take the battle once they've got all of these issues sorted out to the Red Bulls and the Ferraris.
How close do you see Ferrari being to Red Bull based on what we've seen so far in testing?
Well, it's quite tricky. Ferrari have had a very low-key test so far. They've not really kind of pumped in the times. Everybody seems happy with the car. The drivers feel that they've got the experimentation with setup and they've got the balance of the car right. Now, that can be great, but it doesn't mean that the car's very fast. And we haven't seen those kind of headline-grabbing times so far. And even if we do, I'm quite sure exactly what they do tell us. So it's very hard to say. I mean, I think Red Bull have got the edge. Ferrari looks like they're very much in the position they were last year. And we've certainly seen some issues on their longer runs with tyre management, which is quite worrying. Is the one thing that have really kind of got to get sorted out for their season, really to be cohesive and to get those points finishes that they need to build a championship up. But they have been reliable. So I don't know about pace. That's the one thing that we simply can't tell. This time next week, we'll have had the official time practices and sessions. So, that's when when the buck stops and we'll see exactly what they've got to show. But at the moment, it doesn't feel as though Ferrari are in any respect ahead of Red Bull. But I don't know how close they are.